The Roman Republic. Alright, thanks guys. I'll see you later. I'm just kidding. Could you imagine? No, but yeah, the Roman Republic. Let's talk about it. So the Roman Republic was founded in the year 509 BC and is still to this day one of the absolute most influential time periods ever. And you might be asking to yourself, why? Well, I'll tell you. The Romans were actually the first people to ever abandon the traditional way of monarchy and develop a community-led government system. Now, this republican way of government was so influential that even the United States today is still considered a republic and is based on the same basic principles that were instituted by the Romans thousands of years ago. Now, it's obviously very easy to see why these kind of principles would have such an influence on modern government today, but to understand why, in fact, the Romans decided to implement the system, we need to go back to the beginnings of Rome during the age of the kings. Now, the first king to rule over Rome was a man named Romulus. Now, Romulus, along with his brother Remus, were actually the founders of Rome. Eventually, the brothers got into a heated argument as to who would be the rightful one to rule over Rome, and this ultimately resulted in Romulus killing Remus and taking the throne for himself. Now, in addition to taking the throne for himself, Romulus actually formed the city in his own image and named it after himself, hence the name Rome. Now, the next king to rule over Rome was a man named Numa Pompilius. Now, Numa Pompilius was a Sabine who was accredited for having established many of Rome's major religious ceremonies and festivals and practices. In addition to this, Numa also set out to establish peace with all the surrounding countries and cities of Rome, and he actually was very successful in this until his death due to natural causes sometime later. Now, the next king after Numa was a man named Tullus Hostilius. Now, as you can probably tell by his name, Hostilius was a very, hostile and violent ruler. He was basically the complete opposite of Numa in everything. He basically believed that under Numa's rule, Rome had become weak, and such, he set out to wage war with whoever he possibly could. Now, ultimately, this came back to bite him when a series of events unfolded. Now, these events included a meteor shower and a plague, and the people of Rome actually blamed Hostilius for these events happening because they believed that he had rejected gods in order to pursue war. Now, Hostilius didn't believe this for himself until he actually contracted the plague himself, and he actually started to dust off the old religious books of Numa and start practicing those religions in order to appease the gods. Now, this was all going well until he was doing that and he made a mistake, which actually resulted in Zeus striking him down with a lightning bolt, killing him. Now, the next king after that to rule was the last of the Roman kings before the Etruscans took over, and this man was named Ancus Marcius. Now, Ancus was actually the grandson of Numa Pompilius and naturally wanted to follow in his footsteps. Ancus's first matter of business was actually to reestablish the religious observances of his grandfather. Unfortunately, though, all the surrounding towns to Rome took this as a sign of weakness and decided to take advantage and attack Rome. Luckily for Rome, however, Ancus was actually a very capable war general and was able to fight back all incoming attacks and transferred all the citizens from even smaller cities into Rome, resulting in a greatly increased population. Now, the next three kings after Ancus were actually the Etruscan people. Now, the Etruscan people, the first of them was Tarquin the Elder, or Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. And under Tarquin's rule, Circus Maximus was constructed. Now, Circus Maximus was a stadium designed for chariot racing that was also home to many other kind of Roman games. Now, after an accident that Tarquin suffered that left him unable to rule as king, a new king took over. That man was Servius Tullius. Now, Servius was responsible for implementing Rome's first ever census, and the census was a means of counting people by groups of 100. This information was then determined to determine how many voting rights each group of people got, and as well how many people would be sent into the military. Now, after some time, Servius ended up being plotted against and killed by one of his daughters and her husband so that her husband could take the throne for himself. Now, this man was actually Tarquinius Superbus, the grandson of Tarquin the Elder, and he was actually the last of the Roman kings to ever rule over Rome. Now, Tarquinius took the throne over in a very violent way and began ruling the city the same way. One of his first acts as king was sentencing all of the city senators to death, as well as anyone else that even slightly suspected would wrong him. Tarquin's rule eventually got so bad that the people of Rome chased him out of the city, and after they exiled him, they agreed to never again allow any individual to possess complete power over them. This resulted in the invention of the Republic. Now, the Republic way of government, meaning public good, is a system of government in which the people themselves elected representatives to rule on their behalf. And much like our government today, there are three basic major groups that this republic can be divided into. the legislative group, the executive group, and the judicial group. Now, the main people, the executive groups, were the consuls. They were elected yearly in pairs of two, and they essentially had complete military and political power. But in order to prevent one from getting too powerful, there was actually a veto system in which one of the consuls could veto the other's absurd rules if they got too bad. Now, although the consuls were actually the main kind of power in Rome at the time, there were still other groups of Rome that were just as important. The next one that we're going to talk about is the Senate. Now, the Senate was a group made up of no more than 300 people, and they were in charge of handling all the domestic and foreign policies of Rome. They also handled the majority of Rome's major religious aspects. Now, the praetors were the judicial branch of the government of Rome. They were responsible for undertaking the majority of those judicial responsibilities of Rome when the praetors were unable to do so. Now, as you can clearly see, it's very obvious that the Roman Republic was not perfect by any means, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't revolutionary, which it certainly was. The Romans were able to come up with a very successful and fair way to delegate power amongst themselves to ensure that no one individual could ever oppress them again. And these principles have stayed with us all the way until today, making it very clear to see why and how Rome is to this day one of the finest examples of a successful ancient government.